In this video, I will show you how to use Nerdio Manager for Enterprise, starting with version 3.5, to create and manage Azure file shares that are joined to Azure Active Directory. Let's go ahead and start out by going to Storage and Azure Files. And on this page, you will notice that we now have the option to not only join our file shares and their containing storage accounts to Azure ADDS and Active Directory, but also to Azure AD natively. Now, as of the time of the recording of this video, this feature is still in preview. And if you're doing this manually through Microsoft's documentations, there are quite a few steps to go through, but Nerdio Manager, as always, simplifies that process and makes it really easy to go ahead and create such shares. So let's go ahead and click on Add Azure Files. And we will be able to then create a file share either within an existing storage account, or as in this example, we're going to do so in a new account. So what I'm going to do is going to type a name of a new account. Let's call it AADJ Storage 02. So this is going to be a brand new storage account that I'll create. I'm going to put it in my demo resource group. I will store it, let's say, in East US 2. It's going to be premium performance tier. We're going to call this FSLogix 01. Well, let's call it 02 because I think I have a 01 already. So we'll call it FSLogix 01 for the share name. We are going to tell that the minimum capacity, which we can provision, is 100 gigabytes. And we can even add permissions, or in my case, I'll just select an existing host pool, and the system will automatically figure out who's entitled to this host pool and assign permissions. But the key of this feature comes from the following, and that is the ability to select this option right here called Azure AD, which means we're joining this storage account and all of its containing file shares to native Azure AD, which means we no longer need domain controllers or anything else like that. Let's go ahead and select that option. We then have a checkbox that appeared that says assign NTFS file level permissions. And what this does is, in addition to setting up the Azure storage account and the file share, this will spin up a VM, a temporary VM, whose settings are available here under advanced settings. And it will apply the NTFS file level permissions based on what we select up here in this section, and make sure that not only are the Azure RBAC roles set up correctly, but also the NTFS level permissions are done. For sake of speed, I'm going to uncheck this option, which is going to use the default NTFS file level permissions and not spin up a new VM, but it will still create the Azure files and do everything that's needed in Azure AD to make this work. So let's see how that works. I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And once I click OK, this is going to create a new storage account in the East US 2 region. It will mark it as joined to Azure AD and create the necessary app registration in my Azure Active Directory. It will, apply all the necessary storage keys and things like that that are needed based on Microsoft's documentation to make Azure AD-joined file shares work. And once this is done, we will see this file share listed on the screen. And when it's listed on the screen, we have one more step to go through, and that is to grant admin consent for the app registration that is automatically being created. So while this is still running, we can take a look at the process. So right now it's saving password and looks like it's done now. So now we have this newly created FSLogix 02. It is right here. You can see East US, Premium, etc. And you'll notice that there's a little yellow triangle next to Azure AD-joined, which tells you that admin consent still needs to be granted. So we're going to go ahead and click on Add Grant Admin Consent. We're going to sign in. We will click Accept. And once we do that, we can go back to Azure Files under Storage. The page will get refreshed, and we now see that this storage account is fully Azure AD joined. So it's really as easy as that to get an Azure AD joined account going. Once this account is created, then we need to point FSLogix at it. So let's go to Settings and Integrations. And under the FSLogix profile storage section, let's go ahead and create a new FSLogix profile. Let's call this, AADJ, 02, for example. And what we see is if we select from this dropdown and we go to AADJ, here is our FSLogix 02, which is the one we just created. If we select this path, you will notice that this checkbox got automatically checked. And the reason for that is because in addition to being able to join the Azure Files storage account to Azure Active Directory, there are some changes that must be made on the registry of all the session hosts that are going to be using this Azure AD-joined Azure Files account. This is necessary today while Azure Files is in preview mode, but it is something that Nerdio Manager will handle for you automatically. So just make sure that if you're using an Azure AD-joined Azure Files, that this checkbox is checked, specify any needed FSLogix registry options, and click OK. And that's it. Now, if you go to workspaces and you create a new host pool, so let's go ahead and click on that workspace, click Dynamic Host Pool, and from the FSLogix dropdown, we're going to select AADJ02. Any hosts that will be created, and they can also be joined to Azure Active Directory, these hosts will be enabled for Azure AD-joined file shares and will be properly pointed at that location. One thing to keep in mind, and this is really important, is that even though the Azure file share is Azure AD-joined, it still requires that the usernames that are granted access, only users who can access this file share must be hybrid AD users, meaning they must originate in an Active Directory that is synced to Azure AD through Azure AD Connect. You may ask, well, what's the point of doing Azure AD-joined file shares if you still need hybrid identities to be synced? And the answer is you no longer need domain controllers. You can now get rid of joining VMs to domain controllers and joining your Azure file shares to domain controllers. But the identity, the usernames must still originate from an Active Directory on-premises domain, which is then synced over to Azure AD. As we move more and more towards cloud-native AVD deployments, we will see that requirement likely disappear. So you'll be able to use kind of native cloud identities with natively joined Azure AD session hosts, as well as Azure AD file shares. So I hope you found this useful. Again, just to summarize Azure Files, we create a new Azure File, select Azure AD, make sure to grant consent, look for our little green checkbox that it's done, then create an FSLogix profile, and don't forget to check the box that the hosts must be configured for Azure AD-joined storage. I hope you found this useful, and I look forward to seeing you in future videos.